In 1960, India was 13 years old. A teenager of an independent country had its first aircraft carrier with onboard fighters. An amazing thing. The Sea Harrier is in many ways similar to any other fighter aircraft, except that unlike normal fighters, which basically have a nozzle at the back end, which is blowing out all that jet exhaust and propelling the fighter forward, the engine in a Sea Harrier has a module strapped onto it with nozzles that can turn either backward or downwards. So they are basically able to vector the jet exhaust and thrust either backwards for forward movement, or they can swivel downwards for your up-down helicopter-like movement. It's a technology called direct lift. After the Harrier, the British haven't developed a naval aircraft. They haven't developed an aircraft specifically purpose-built for naval operations after the Sea Harrier.
Did no one in the system at any point think that, hey, एक LCA program भी चल रहा है, हमारा खुद का ship आने वाला है. Why not also start? Let's see if we can get somewhere with it.
In our defense podcast, you've developed this habit of putting your finger once again straight in the pain point. A naval fighter is not going to be purchased in as many numbers as an Air Force fighter. An Air Force fighter like the Tejas, you're going to buy 220, 300, 400. The AMCA, you're going to buy like 300, 400 aircraft. A naval fighter, you require 30, 40. 20, 30, 40. The Rafale deal that is going to be signed this financial year is 27 aircraft.
Yeah. Hello and welcome. This is the 39th episode of In Our Defense, and it's a very warm welcome to all our listeners and viewers. Hello Shiv, hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Dev?
All well, all well. I'm actually very excited about the topic of our day. I mean, for some it might be a bit, sort of like, academic, boring, but I'm excited because we go back to a topic which I think has been so far when it comes to viral moments of In Our Defense Season 2, the star of this podcast. Your take on who among the two sets of fighter jet pilots that most militaries have, naval fighter pilots and Air Force fighter pilots, is cooler and better. If you remember that clip, Shiv, do you? Or do you hate me for bringing it up again on once after every episode?
No, because nobody ever reminds me about that clip on all my social media. So hopefully on this episode we'll get a chance to redeem ourselves.
Yes.
And I will explain that a little better also.
Yes. Actually, yes, that's exactly why I'm happy we're discussing this, because that'll kind of actually, apart from the fun aspect of that viral clip, where, for our listeners and viewers who haven't chanced upon that clip, it's basically where I asked Shiv if comparing between Air Force fighter pilots and naval fighter pilots, are naval fighter pilots cooler and better? And Shiv had said yes, they are, which got quite the reaction from within the community, especially.
They haven't forgiven me yet.
Yes,
so, yeah.
But this episode will actually give us that space to kind of get in the serious business of fighter jets, naval fighter jets especially, and talk about exactly why you said what you said. What we're going to do, we're going to talk about the evolution, the history, and the status of India's naval fighter jet. I won't say program as such, because we've never really had a program for naval fighter jets. Why we didn't is actually a question that I'm going to bring up on this episode. But before we do that, let's briefly, maybe for the first half or first quarter of this episode, talk about the history of naval aviation in India, because that's not something we really talk much about, especially when it comes to the planes on the decks of those fighter carriers that we have. Everyone knows the old INS Vikrant. Everyone knows the INS Virat, which sadly was broken up instead of being converted into a museum ship. But that's a separate controversy. Everyone knows about INS Vikrant, which we have in service, and everyone knows about the new INS Vikrant, on which we had a full episode a few months ago when it was commissioned into the Indian Navy. But we're going to talk about the jets on these fighter carriers, and we'll start with the first one ever, the INS Vikrant, which was the HMS Hercules. If I'm not wrong, this ship was being built in the UK during World War II. It didn't reach completion, and then the World War ended, and I think the UK Navy didn't really see much point in completing the project, and then India kind of bought it and made INS Vikrant. And along with INS Vikrant came the Seahawks, which flew on the ship. So as we start, tell me about the that time, because on this episode we talk about how procurements work, how there's a need, there are negotiation, there's some sort of document that's floated out, there are competitions, etc. But this is back in the 60s. India had freshly become independent. You had young leaders within the military kind of going up the ranks, replacing the British era officers. When was a need for a fighter carrier and naval fighter jets felt in India back then, and how much can you tell us about what happened for us to get the INS Vikrant and the Seahawks?
So it's a very interesting tale because the 1950s, young, newly independent India, shortly after the World Wars, was sort of finding its feet, as it were, as a new country, and all the different challenges that came after partition with new neighbors and the rest of it. This was pre 1971, so there was a completely separate dynamic. This was also pre 1962, which brought its own dynamics as far as the war with China was concerned. The 1950s for India was an interesting time because this was in many ways sort of the peak, or the sort of the genesis of India's quote-unquote non-aligned movement. There were many pulls and pressures with the Cold War sort of heating up over which side a country the size of India would actually turn to. And it was no surprise whatsoever. And the India-Russia relationship, militarily speaking, was still to fully mature into the kind of amazing relationship it would later become. So in the 50s, the only real, or really the closest relationship that India had, internationally speaking, was with its colonial ruler until a few years before that, which was Britain. And post independence, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, did create a platform for military support to India in terms of trade, in terms of various things, which is why practically all of Indian aircraft in the military of that time are basically of British origin. Some are Anglo-French, but largely of British origin. In the 50s, with India realizing that such a large country needing to have a credible military presence, not just on land, owing to, and remember this was before the 1965 war. So even though the 1947 post-partition operations had taken place and we had fought a military operation against Pakistan, a full-scale war had not yet happened. That would happen only in 1965. So this was a time of relative peace. It was a time of relative uncertainty. I sometimes think about that time. What must it have been like before the era of war for India actually began with the 1962, 65 and 71 wars. It was an interesting time because India was not only establishing its identity but also crafting its military might. And all the moves that it made at this time were very, very important. And I think the fact that India at that time felt the need for an aircraft carrier is amazing. You're talking about the Nehru era, right? And the HMS Hercules, which would later become the INS Vikrant, like you rightly pointed out, was an aircraft carrier that had been built during the war. It had been used by the Royal Navy, and discussions took place between India and the United Kingdom, and it was decided that this ship would be transferred to India with a complement of fighters on its deck, like you said, the Hawker Seahawk. So 1960, if I'm not mistaken, is the year in which the Hawker Seahawk officially became India's first ever deck-based fighter. Amazingly landmark occasion because so in 1960, India was 13 years old. A teenager of an independent country had its first aircraft carrier with onboard fighters. An amazing thing. I mean, there's yes, of course, it was our military was under the British for the longest time, so it's not like India was spring chickens. I'm not saying that, but for an independent country, to have the maturity and the wherewithal to be able to absorb something as complicated as a carrier in the 50s and 60s. Hats off to the powers that be. So the Indian Navy got its first taste of deck-based naval aviation through the Hawker Hunter, which served for a couple of decades at least, if I'm not mistaken. Shortly thereafter, I think it was in the 70s when a French aircraft called the Alizé came into service. Now the Hawker, the Seahawk that came into service with the Indian Navy was a version of a very successful Air Force fighter that the British had already built. It was in service with many militaries around the world. With the Alizé that came a few years later, also based on the Vikrant. Remember, by this time, the Vikrant had also been joined by the Virat.
Yes.
The Virat had come in, a couple of decades later. But at a time when India had basically two aircraft carriers, an aircraft called the Alizé arrived on the scene. The Alizé was a French aircraft. It was a deck-based fighter, very, very iconic in naval lore because it was that first aircraft in Indian service which had those beautiful folded wings, wings that could fold on the deck to give aviators more space on the carrier deck. So these two aircraft, the Seahawk and the Alizé, comprised the first two, the kind of vintage phase of the Indian Navy's tryst with deck-based aviation. And now, obviously, listeners and viewers of In Our Defense know that naval aircraft are of many different kinds. Not all aircraft are operated from an aircraft carrier deck. Navies operate aircraft from shore as well. But this episode, we're talking only about deck-based fighter aircraft. Therefore, I'm not mentioning many of the other aircraft that the Indian Navy also operated at this time. So the Seahawk was the first. Then came the Alizé. And then came one of my favorite aircraft and most people's favorite aircraft of all time, which was the Harrier, the Sea Harrier, which is a variant of the Harrier. Again, British came into service at that time, which was it's difficult to put into words what a legacy leap that was, because the Sea Harriers had basically proven during the early 80s, during the Falklands War, that the British had the capacity to execute a military operation all the way across the Atlantic, down in South America, against the Argentinian military, and the Sea Harrier, this sort of very compact little fighter that could do a trick that no other aircraft could, which was a vertical takeoff and landing. Meant that the Royal Military was able to actually send a kind of very compact carrier force to a great distance and be able to get Argentina to bend. So the Sea Harrier, for all its diminutive size, etc., was an amazing machine, and it came into service with the Indian Navy. So the Sea Harrier sort of started the modern era, I would say. The vintage was gone. Then the modern era of Indian naval aviation actually started. And we're still in that era because the Sea Harriers were retired only a few years ago. They were upgraded. Many nice things were done to them. They were given Israeli weapons. But every machine has its life. And unfortunately, they had to be bid farewell. And the aircraft that replaced the Sea Harriers are the aircraft that we currently have in service right now, which are the Russian MiG-29Ks.
And before we get to them, I just wanted to go on a bit tangent when it came to the Sea Harriers, because I knew you'd bring this up, and I have a feeling even I'd bring this up. Their ability to take off vertically and land vertically. Now, like a dumb moment for me, that seems the most obvious kind of technology to have for every single naval fighter jet across the world, right? That's like, you don't need then a longish runway. You don't need to worry about size and stuff like that. Don't need to worry about, the plane not hitting the deck on landing or failing to, have sufficient boost while taking off. Great for safety as well. So then why is it that this technology has not evolved to, to a stage that you have every single naval fighter jet in the world using this technology?
Because it's so terribly complicated. That's the simple answer. And I'll tell you, I'm glad you asked this question because, and I'm telling you that Harrier pilots love being asked this question as well. First, I'll tell you what it is that allows a Sea Harrier to execute that amazing trick of being able to land and take off vertically, unlike a conventional fixed-wing fighter. The Sea Harrier is in many ways similar to any other fighter aircraft, except that unlike normal fighters, which basically have a nozzle at the back end, which is blowing out all that jet exhaust and propelling the fighter forward, the engine in a Sea Harrier has a module strapped onto it with nozzles that can turn either backward or downwards. So they are basically able to vector the jet exhaust and thrust either backwards for forward movement, or they can swivel downwards for your up-down helicopter-like movement. It's a technology called direct lift. Now, direct lift was a technology pioneered by the British, and one has to acknowledge that post-war British aviation technology is unparalleled in the world. No country has been able to match that kind of technology in that era. Harrier technology, and I'll tell you why nobody's been able to replicate it ever since. There are complicated reasons for it. So you basically take an engine, you strap on this kind of direct lift module onto it, and you build a fighter around it. And so a Harrier pilot in his or her cockpit is able to basically, in a very complicated symphony of maneuvers, tell the engine which way to point the jet exhaust. So when those nozzles are swiveled down, the pilot has the ability to make the aircraft rise up or down in a vertical way. And then when the nozzles turn backwards, then you've got forward movement. This amazing flexibility obviously means that for a Harrier, a runway becomes redundant, because a Harrier can quite literally land on any reasonably flat surface, including a carrier deck, which is why, in terms of flexibility, in terms of the sheer possibilities of a Harrier, no aircraft has ever come close to it. But the very same technology that gives it this flexibility also introduces many drawbacks. The amount of fuel consumption taken in a direct lift configuration is significantly more than a normal jet engine. So in a tiny little fighter with very limited fuel space, fuel consumption is everything, which means there's a compromise on how many weapons you can carry. Point number 2, the Harrier was subsonic, and this was a hugely important issue for militaries, because this is a fighter by virtue of its engine configuration and choosing direct lift rather than conventional thrust. It meant that this aircraft couldn't go supersonic. It couldn't break the sound barrier. And for various different reasons, being able to break the sound barrier is a huge compulsion for military aviation. Your aircraft has to be able to go supersonic for various different things. So as a result of this, the Sea Harrier, for all its beautiful flexibility, was seen as a compromise kind of aircraft. Now, we have to remember that the Sea Harrier is still in service. Or rather, the Harrier is still in service. The US Marines still use Harriers because literally no other aircraft has been able to do the kind of stunt that the Harrier can actually do. The F-35, the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II aircraft, which became the US Air Force's, the US military's biggest ever fighter program, is only the next aircraft that came along that could do the same thing that the Harrier could. The F-35B, which is what the US Marine Corps needed, is basically an aircraft that was built specifically to replace the Harrier, because the Marines said, we want a jump jet. We need a jump jet. We're not going to compromise on that. We need a jet that can take off and land vertically. And obviously the technology that goes into the F-35B is significantly different from the Harrier. they execute the same trick of being able to land vertically and take off like a Harrier, but they don't use direct lift. They use something called a lift fan, which is a separate technology. We can discuss that in another episode maybe. But the fruits of the Harrier, what the Harrier brought to the fight, it's interesting to see that all the years after most of them have retired, people still want that technology because there is value in being able to land an aircraft vertically.
Yeah, and that is why I think this whole topic is pretty cool. Like you said at the beginning of this episode, that within like 15 years of your independence, you had an aircraft carrier, and within like a half a decade or maybe a decade after that, you also had this very cool piece of equipment that for that time was far technology advanced, and even now, like you've just described. That was an aside on the Harrier and the tech that's used on that fighter jet. Let's move back to our discussion. The MiG-29Ks, which are what we operate right now, and then we'll get to obviously the Indian program, so to speak, if there even is one. But before that, in fact, because we're talking about that, so mota, while I was jotting down stuff, what I've realized is with the Indian Navy's fighter jet / aircraft carrier program or projects, there is roughly sort of a 2-decade, 20-year cycle where you have one carrier coming in and then maybe 20 years later you are either thinking of a new one or you're kind of about to get a new one. So you had the Vikrant, the original Vikrant in the 60s, you had the Virat in the 80s, late 80s, you had the Vikramaditya in the 2000s. And also what I noticed was these are almost like package deals, so to speak. So you had the Vikrant original one coming with the Seahawks. There's an overlap between the Harriers, but you kind of had the Harriers coming with the Virat, which was HMS Hermes, also a UK Navy ship, and you had the MiG-29Ks coming with the Vikramaditya, which is a Russian aircraft carrier originally called Admiral Gorshkov. Now I want to know why and when to be know it was in the 2000s. Why did India choose to make the shift from British aircraft carriers to a Russian one? Was it, like you said at the start of this episode, that perhaps that military friendship that India had developed with Russia had finally come to fruition? And were the MiG-29Ks part of sort of this package deal that you take this carrier and you get these planes, or were these two separate, discussions that, we also need planes, we also need a carrier. Hey, it looks like you have both and both seem great for us, so better give us both. How did it go about?
So the brief answer to that is, after the Harrier, the British haven't developed a naval aircraft. They haven't developed an aircraft specifically purpose-built for naval operations after the Sea Harrier. Remember that after the Sea Harrier, the British and Europe in general had basically figured that each country building its own fighter is an uneconomical, expensive hell of a proposition, and that's why countries started coming together to build fighters. It was decided in the 80s that a group of European countries would come together and build an aircraft together. They would all pitch in. They would all add their own components and their own work share and their own expertise and build one fighter, and each of their militaries would buy them. It would make sense. It would cost less money, and it would create jobs in all these countries. And cooperatively, let's build a fighter. The result of that cooperation was the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is a fighter that is now in service with the UK, with Spain, Italy, all these countries. The problem was France said, "Nahi, humko nahi karna tum logon ke sath. We don't want this stuff. We have an amazing aviation legacy." I mean, it was more complicated than that. They thought it was an unfair equation and stuff, and there were complicated reasons why they didn't want to be part of the Typhoon program. But France said, "Screw you guys, we're going to go our own way." And the result of that going our own way was the Rafale. Now, the Rafale and the Typhoon are very similar aircraft in many ways. Even when you look at them in terms of pictures, if you're not an aviation expert, they look kind of similar. They're similar in size. They both don't have, they both have those canard four planes in the front. They're both twin engine fighters. So the aircraft kind of came from the same kind of aviation legacy, but they were very different And the most basic difference was the Rafale that was built by, and developed by the French was built as a naval fighter from the start.
Yes.
While the Typhoon was built as an Air Force fighter from the start. Difference number two, the Rafale as a naval fighter was possible to quickly convert it into an Air Force fighter. Because that is possible. A naval fighter is a complicated machine, but converting it into an Air Force fighter is easy. Here you're flying it on a deck. We need to fly it on the shore. Some modifications, ho jayega. But converting an Air Force fighter into a naval fighter is when hell begins to show its face. And while the Typhoon had some plans on paper to become a naval fighter, it just wasn't deemed economical, which is why the Eurofighter Typhoon is a strictly Air Force fighter. It's not used by any other service. So the Brits didn't have a naval fighter. And that's the reason why the United Kingdom had to officially join the Joint Strike Fighter program in the United States. For the first time in their history, and it was a symptom of globalization, a symptom of post-Cold War consolidation of resources, a kind of sad farewell to the British aviation legacy that had been there since the war. But the British basically stopped developing a naval aircraft, and they didn't have a naval aircraft development in going, which is why now the Royal Navy uses the F-35B.
Yes.
The F-35B, which is the jump jet that I was talking about, which is the Harrier, the new Harrier, is the aircraft that has come into service with the HMS Elizabeth and other carriers like that. So that's the reason why India didn't have a choice in this matter. We have to remember, Dev, that building a deck-based fighter is a extremely small and exclusive club.
Yes.
Very few countries do it. So when India chose the Admiral Gorshkov as a carrier, which became the INS Vikrant, it's not like it was buying a carrier and there was a brochure with, there are these 5-6 fighters, aap choose kar lo ki kaun sa fighter chahiye aapko. It doesn't work like that. It's very complicated because a carrier also has a kind of native fighter.
Yes.
It's built for a particular kind of fighter, or a fighter is built for that particular carrier because the sizes of lifts, the length of a runway, the size of the hangars where they are stored, the well deck, all the many different things that go into a carrier, they are tailor-made for a certain kind of fighter. So your big Nimitz class carriers, etc., which the United States uses, are built for large, F-14, F-18 kind of fighters. The Gorshkov was built for smaller fighters like the MiG-29K. And so it didn't make sense for India to actually, look at any other kind of fighter and force it. Even though, interestingly, when the Gorshkov was under consideration, many fighter manufacturers conducted simulated studies to see if their fighters were compatible with the Gorshkov. Boeing did it with the F-18. Dassault did it with the Rafale. Basically trying to convince India ki don't buy this Russian bullshit. Our fighters are equally compatible with the Gorshkov and you do it. But this was Russia. I mean, this was Russia saying, like, who are you going to believe? It's our aircraft carrier. Humko pata hai ki kya chalta hai is pe. So you have to buy the Gorshkov, and this is the best fighter for it. And let's not mistake ourselves that the MiG-29 was like a compromise candidate. It's a bloody good fighter. It's a really good fighter. The MiG-29K is basically the deck-based version of a fighter aircraft that is in service with the Indian Air Force in large numbers, upgraded, very respected, an extremely fine fighter aircraft. It's basically the fighter that Russia built to tackle the F-16 of the United States. So the MiG-29K is an excellent fighter. But now India has needed to move on from it. That's the only problem. So when India was faced with the purchase of these aircraft carriers, there was very little elbow room in terms of what it could actually get.
Yeah, right. And yeah, so now India has needed to move on, and now we'll kind of get into the crux of this episode of the lack, really, what I see at least when again I'm jotting down my notes, because I don't know the nitty gritties and I don't have that inside knowledge, inside scoops. But when you just kind of lay it down on a piece of paper, you kind of can see a glaring lack of a naval fighter program altogether. But after a quick break.
The main focus here is of the BNP making this demand to extradite Sheikh Hasina. How is India going to react? How is India going to see this? And what will India's steps be? I'm quoting what Alamgir said. He said that Sheikh Hasina has to face the law of Bangladesh for all the crimes and corruption committed by her and her regime. And Hasina and the Awami League are both condemned here, and standing by them will only worsen the perception of India in Bangladesh.
This is a ticking time bomb, I'd say. And I don't say this because we should not engage Awami League. They have been very good to us. Sheikh Hasina, as a neighborhood leader, has been very, very good to India. In fact, the fear is that Bangladesh will no longer be the country, the trusted partner that India saw in her. And if the General Secretary is saying that keeping Sheikh Hasina in India could cost the two countries its good diplomatic ties, and that is something that India will have to actually think over. This is BNP's demand. So it's a political demand for now. There is no request from interim government, so to say. The request has to come from the interim government. Political parties can make demands. Okay. Professor Yunus, I don't think, will be doing that right now. These are not the feathers he wants to ruffle. If he's looking westward, America would not want that. America was not of much help in looking into India's considerations when all this happened, but they will surely consider this.
Hello and welcome back. Shiv and I are discussing India's naval fighter jets. Up until now, we've talked about the history of Indian Navy's fighter jets. We've had several versions of UK-based fighter jets, and then one mainstay that's been there for the last 20-25 years, I think, the MiG-29K that's on INS Vikrant, and also I'm guessing now on INS Vikrant. INS Vikrant, the new one. Very interesting over here. So, you got the Vikramaditya around in the 2000s, if I'm not wrong, and
2013.
Sorry, you started to think of getting the Vikramaditya from Russia in the 2000s. You got it in 2013, and back then you also had started thinking of developing your own aircraft carrier, because I think you had realized now perhaps it's come time to see if we can do it. So let's also start, trying to figure out a way to do that. And ultimately, that became INS Vikrant, which was commissioned a few months ago. And again, we did a whole episode on that, a link in the show notes. What the sense I got is that you never thought, okay, we're going to be building a new aircraft carrier, and perhaps once we get that technology and that know-how, we'll perhaps build more versions of it. The sense I'm getting is that we never thought of building a fighter jet for this new aircraft carrier that you were building. You knew that, a second-hand ship you're importing, you're getting these Russian fighter jets, but at some point they're going to get old. And at some point you're going to need new fighter jets for your future aircraft carriers. So I don't want to say it was lack of foresight, even though, we love using very, very strong words and terminologies when it comes to India's military equipment development process. But you kind of getting my drift, where I'm coming from, where I'm getting at. Yet at the same time, around the same time, you had a fighter jet program going on. Note the missing naval word in that, the LCA program, which became the Tejas. Now, on a previous episode, you've explained really well, and I think it kind of goes back to your earlier answer right now, just before the break, of why the LCA program was not really fit to be a naval program, because of something that you spoke about and something that you've spoken about in detail, that it's very, very difficult to take a Air Force fighter jet and turn that into a naval fighter jet. So the sense I'm getting again is that the LCA program was never envisioned to ever be in a place where it would also supply the Navy. My question then is why? You were developing an aircraft carrier on your own. Did no one in the system at any point think that, hey, एक LCA program भी चल रहा है, हमारा खुद का ship आने वाला है, why not also start, let's see if we can get somewhere with it. Like you said, it's difficult. Very few countries in the world even choose to develop their or make their own fighter jets, naval fighter jets. It could have been difficult, but did no one ever think of doing that? Because if they had back then, perhaps we wouldn't be talking about this topic today.
in our defense podcast, you've developed this habit of putting your finger once again straight in the pain point. So let's take this up. This is the maza of this episode, and you know how I love going into where it really hurts. So let's look at all the different questions you've asked me, and I'll answer them one by one. First off, I will start by saying that when it comes to foresight, the one service that usually can't be blamed is the Indian Navy.
Yes.
And the reason I've blamed in one of our previous episodes, which we'll share in the show notes also, is that the Indian Navy doesn't have the luxury of changing decisions at the last minute, because it takes so long. It takes years or decades for equipment to be built and arrive that the Indian Navy has no choice but to pre-plan, premeditate, pre-order years and years and years in advance. So organized foresight and pre-planning is now a part of the culture and DNA of the Navy, and it's a very, very good thing that many, not just the Army and Air Force, but in general, organizations should be able to learn from that kind of pre-planning. It's an amazing cultural lesson. Having said that, now the LCA program started in the 1980s as a program to basically deliver a light fighter aircraft for the Indian Air Force. Not a very complicated term of reference. It was supposed to be an aircraft that would, over its development cycle and delivery period, replace some of India's aging aircraft, including the MiG-21, and some of the other fighters that are there in Indian service. Now, I'm sure at the time that things started off with the LCA, there must have been some noises within the system saying that, why don't we also consider making this a naval fighter? But there are good reasons why it didn't happen, and but the question you ask is a fair one. A, because India was entering a very difficult program of developing its own fighter aircraft. It had taken on a mission to develop its own fighter aircraft, which was going to be an onerous, extremely difficult task, where it knew that it would have to depend on foreign agencies for certain technologies. And let's not go back to the engine story, because I'm tired of that topic. Maybe we'll revisit it after the 50th episode.
Yes.
But at that time, if there were any suggestions from within the system that maybe we should think about a naval fighter as well, they would have been very quickly silenced, because at that time the system was focused on, yeah, dekho, ye already काफी complicated hai. Let's not be too ambitious. Let's get this done first. Let's get the LCA done first. Which has its own merits. The idea was to be as laser focused and consistent and and committed to the LCA program without getting distracted by trying to do too many things, because it's a fair argument. If you try and aim for too many things, Air Force fighter bhi banao, naval fighter bhi banao, you might end up with neither. So a decision was taken, and I don't even think it was a decision. I don't think the naval fighter suggestion ever became something that required a decision. It simply wasn't there, which is why by 2001, when the Tejas first flew, even at that time there was no suggestion within the system that why don't we look at it as a naval fighter as well. The actual Naval LCA program started sometime later, and the point that you mentioned and which we've spoken about variously before is that converting a purpose-built Air Force fighter, a fighter that is built for conventional, takeoff and landing from a normal runway, converting that into a naval fighter that is capable of taking off and landing from an aircraft carrier deck is an engineering nightmare. It is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's not impossible, as the Naval LCA has proven, because India has damn good development scientists and engineers, and there's no doubt about that. And the Naval LCA team is actually one of the bravest and most capable teams that India has when it comes to aviation. But the fact is that the Naval LCA in many ways was sort of doomed from the start. The reason for that is that the Indian Navy, right off the bat, had said, look, we will support this program. We will support this program, but sort of unofficially and officially, the Navy basically made it known that, while the program has our support in terms of money, in terms of, we will cheer it on because we believe in Make in India, etc., we don't think it's going to meet our requirements. Because by the time an aircraft of this kind comes online, our requirements are going to be significantly more. At the very surface level, we are going to want a twin-engine fighter. Because when you're talking about naval aviation, things have changed now, but when you're talking about naval aviation, the conventional wisdom is a twin-engine fighter is required for safety reasons. In case one engine flames out, you've still got one engine to make it back safely, etc. So the conventional wisdom dictated that a single-engine fighter simply will not do. Of course, in the modern age, you've got very, very highly reliable engines, which is why the F-35C is a naval fighter with a single engine. But that's a separate issue. So the Indian Navy sort of held the hand of the LCA Tejas Navy, LCA Navy, right through its development. It was very, very supportive. It was it kind of decided to draw the line and say we can't use the LCA Navy as a frontline combat platform, with a great deal of sadness and reluctance, because the Indian Navy genuinely loves made in India stuff. They genuinely like it. But here they had to, with a degree of agony, say, boss, ye hamare liye nahi hai ye. We can't use this fighter. But that didn't stop the LCA Navy from, consistently trying to prove itself more and more and more. It has emerged as a very capable light fighter. And even at this stage, the amazing thing about the LCA Navy is that even at this stage, even after all that engineering, even after all that development work and very, very hard, committed testing work that was done by a brave team of testers, the LCA Navy is not down and out. It's not flown into the sunset. It's not sitting somewhere on some airfield. It is still landing on India's newest aircraft carrier, the Made in India Vikrant. It's still conducting tests. It's still the team still feels optimistic that maybe one squadron of the LCA Navy may be bought as a kind of test or training platform for pilots. Why not have your own naval fighter, even if it's the LCA Navy, in order to train your pilots in deck-based aviation, that's landings and takeoff, arrested landings and short takeoffs. So that kind of door is actually still open. But like you said, India made many missteps in terms of the naval fighter issue. But I think it would be a little unfair to call them missteps, because a naval fighter is a very difficult thing, and India doesn't have the luxury of saying, chalo, ye bhi develop karenge or ye bhi develop karenge, and we have enough money to do a fighter aircraft, and we have enough money to do a nuclear submarine and a naval fighter. And most importantly, when I close this point, is please remember that a naval fighter is not going to be purchased in as many numbers as an Air Force fighter. An Air Force fighter like the Tejas, you're going to buy 220, 300, 400. The AMCA, you're going to buy like 300, 400 aircraft. A naval fighter, you require 30, 40, 20, 30, 40. The Rafale deal that is going to be signed this financial year is 27 aircraft. Yeah. So a naval fighter is also required in very small numbers. So are you going to develop your own naval fighter in order to just buy 20, 30? How are you going to justify the money spent on developing a fighter if you're only going to buy a few? Thinking it's going to be exported is a pipe dream. Yeah. So why would you do that? And that's where the twin-engine deck-based fighter comes in.
Yeah. That's a point I wanted to discuss. That so then what's next for the Navy? Because like you said, we are buying 26 Rafale naval fighter jets. I think the deal is will be signed sometime by the end of this year. Negotiations are still going on. you have around a complement of around, I think, 45, 46 odd MiG-29Ks that are operated on both the INS Vikramaditya, INS Vikrant. There's talk of getting one more version of the INS Vikrant. So obviously the Rafales are not going to be enough to completely replace all the MiGs. There will be some, it'll be basically, you'll have a combination of the two right now in service. A topic that you love, by the way, of having two different variants of fighter jets in the same service. But that's something we'll just leave aside. We've talked about that too many times. So where does that leave the Navy? I'm guessing one reason for also ordering just 26 Rafale jets is that you don't really have the money. It's a damn expensive fighter jet in the first place. And remember, you also have to buy them for your Air Force, by the way. There's one option, like you said, the twin-engine deck-based fighter. But again, then the question is, like you said, is it really worth investing so many thousands of crores of rupees when you're going to end up buying 40, 50, 60? Are you going to be able to recover that investment? So then the question then in front of me, and I'm guessing also in front of Navy and maybe the planners and everybody else, is then what do you do? Is there a plan in place? I'm talking practically now. I mean, there's one thing to have a sort of a philosophical quandary about what to do, but is there really a sure-footed plan in place? Because right now all we know is that the Navy is going to get 26 new Rafale jets, but that's it. Uske baad kya?
So yes, the happy news is that there is a plan in place. The sad news is the plan in place has been forced by a lack of having many plans in place before. Okay, and that's the bitter truth. I'm not being facetious about this. The truth of the matter is, and we've said this many times before on our podcast, and let me say it straight, we definitely do. Lobbies don't work in military contracting. And, if something can be made with equal quality and capability here in India, I'm all for it. The truth of the matter is, let's decode this one piece at a time. Number one, the MiG-29K is not going anywhere in a hurry. Let's first of all dispel this myth. The MiG-29Ks are actually relatively new fighters. They arrived like about a decade ago. They've got a good couple of decades left in them going forward. So the MiG-29Ks are not going anywhere in a hurry. Okay, that's point number one. We've got about 45 left. There are problems with them. We've discussed those, but the MiG-29s are there. It's not like Rafale aayega, MiG-29 is out of the picture. They're not. They're there. Point number two, your Rafale fighter jets, the 27 Rafale fighter jets, are being bought as what is described in reports as a stopgap. Now, there is no word I hate more than stopgap, because stopgap is basically your way of saying, shit, I forgot to do these things 10 years or 15 or 20 years ago, and therefore I need to spend 60,000 crores of public taxpayers' money as a stopgap. Okay, and I'm being very polite about this, believe me. Why should anyone need a stopgap? A stopgap is a cuss word in my view, because it basically means you've failed to plan, or your programs have failed, or your foresight has failed, or your procurement culture has let you down, and you're needing a stopgap, which goes very much to the question you asked previously, which is, what about foresight? Why didn't we think of this earlier? Now, it's easy for you and me to sit here and say, "Arey, kyun nahi kiya?" and stuff. It's complicated. There's no one person or one government or one service to blame. These things do happen. These are extremely complicated issues with a million moving parts and lots of pulls and pressures, including diplomatic. But having said that, now we're faced with a situation where the MiG-29Ks are not going anywhere in a hurry. We are about to sign our second deal with France for Rafale fighters. These are naval fighters which will presumably be deployed on board the INS Vikrant, the new INS Vikrant. We don't know whether there's going to be an INS Vikrant 2 or not. That's a whole separate pain point which we will return to at some point. And then you've got this twin-engine deck-based fighter. Now, the reason the Rafale is called, the Rafale program is being justified as a stopgap is because the larger picture ahead for the Indian Navy is that we're not going to stop with INS Vikrant. We are going to need more aircraft carriers in the future, perhaps with electromagnetic launch systems and who knows, maybe even nuclear powered going aage, etc., etc. Which means that if we start planning now, we'll have our own deck-based fighter, which I think is excellent news. Okay, let's for a moment forget about past failures to plan, etc. The fact that the twin-engine deck-based fighter is a credible, government-recognized, sanctioned program right now means that we are actually thinking 20, 30 years ahead, which is brilliant in my view. Because 20, 30 years ahead, when your MiG-29Ks are gone, when your Rafales are at the end of their lives, a twin-engine deck-based fighter, and I'm not saying that's how long it's going to take for it to deliver. It's going to deliver far before that. But I'm saying that if you've already planned for a kind of future made in India, developed in India fighter aircraft, then you're prepared for what comes next. Because we don't know what supply lines are going to be like as far as these aircraft are concerned. The Rafale 27 Rafales is a solid naval fleet. It's a solid naval fleet for a navy of India's size, and these will be operating alongside the 36 Rafales that the Indian Air Force already uses. But the problem with imports, and this is again something that I repeat very often, is imports force more imports. When you import something, the amount of money and energy you've spent on A, acquisition, and B, readying your force to absorb that technology, train, and be able to operate that technology means you've basically created a platform to buy more of the same. Like the Rafale. The Rafale is a great example of that. When you've bought 36 Rafales for the Air Force, it stands to reason that the Navy would buy the same, even though the Navy conducted trials, etc. It stands to reason because there are economies, there are savings to be had, commonality, so many obvious advantages of operating the same kind of aircraft. Like you said, the Air Force needs more fighters. Is it going to conduct this extravagant, beauty contest once again? Or is it going to go with the fighter it already has? Or is it going to choose yet another fighter? So all those arguments are still going to be there. But again, the thing is, unless you draw a line in the sand and say, stopgap means stopgap. Stopgap means stopgap. Means this is the last. This is the last time we will, order this kind of aircraft. Or we will build this aircraft in India, and therefore, if we have this aircraft again, they will be rolling off an Indian line, which is also perfectly acceptable. Or are you going to go the way and say that, no, that's it. No more foreign stuff. We're going to build our own fighter. Will it have an Indian engine? Where is that engine going to come from? Which engine are you going to use? Are you going to be able to turn it around in time? What if it comes too soon? Where is it going to operate? Which other operators will be there? Do we have enough money to develop a twin-engine deck-based fighter for the Indian Navy to operate? Which other customers will it have apart from the Indian Navy? Will this fighter also be a Air Force fighter? Since you're building it as a naval fighter, turn the issue on its head. It's a twin-engine fighter like the Rafale. Will it be an Indian Rafale? The twin-engine deck-based fighter can also be a twin-engine shore-based fighter for the Indian Air Force. So then why does the Indian Air Force need any other aircraft then? Rafale ya F-15 ke baad khatam kar do. Now we get it. But then what about the AMCA? You see how complicated these things are. So, and a country like India doesn't have the luxury of saying, let's do all these things and then we'll decide later. We can't do that. So the twin-engine deck-based fighter is a marvelous idea. It's a very promising, clean sheet design of a new futuristic fighter. But there are difficult questions to answer as far as that is concerned. Something else will have to be sacrificed. There is no gentle way of putting it. When you want to do the hard thing, sacrifices will have to be made. Because we do not have boundless resources in terms of procurement budget to develop all kinds of aircraft and then say, we'll decide later which ones we want. We can't do it because this is sunk money. Yeah. So if we're going to develop a futuristic twin-engine deck-based fighter for the Indian Navy as its future carrier-based fighter platform, then the bad news is something is going to have to be dropped. Whether it is an Air Force program, whether it's a program in some other wing of the military, whether it is in the Indian Navy itself, something will have to stop. Because that era of सब कुछ करेंगे, that era is over.
Yeah. I'm really glad you addressed that point because, many times on this show, we look at past decisions taken or sometimes not taken and criticize them and, ask questions about kaisa kyun nahi kiya, waisa kyun nahi kiya. But this reality that we've just talked about with respect to a project that's very much in front of us, that's very much, for the next 20 to 30 years, that kind of gives us that whole complexity. And I can imagine two dudes 30 years from now having their own podcast on defense, looking back at this moment in time of India and saying, "Yeah, when that twin engine deck-based fighter jet program had ye karna chahiye tha, wo karna chahiye. This is the reason we are in a mess."
And there will be.
And there will be.
Yeah.
Right. As we end this episode, one like a final note to end this episode actually is the future of naval fighter jets with respect to the technology of drones. That's not something that really gets a lot of traction when it comes to drones. You've like we've discussed in I think one of our previous episodes, we see drones mostly as surveillance, as very close combat sort of helpful piece of equipment. But you have the Predator drone that the Indian Air Force is acquiring, which is technically a fighter drone, like a fighter jet without a pilot in it. After that episode actually of ours, I actually went back and looked for actual photos of a Predator drone at an airfield so that I could compare the size, and I was shocked by the size of it. It actually is almost the size of a fighter jet.
It's an aircraft, yeah.
So yeah, like you said, it's an aircraft. So with this technology definitely going to be even more advanced in the coming years, is there a thinking within the Indian system that perhaps maybe a few years down the line we won't perhaps need a lot of manned fighter jets for the Navy, for the Indian Navy? Because when it comes to naval aviation, the one thing that you want, the top of your list, is safety for your pilot, and drones take that concern out of the picture. They might be damn expensive, but if you lose a drone, at least you don't lose a pilot. The pilot is safe on your ship somewhere in a sort of video game simulator, maneuvering that piece. So is there a thinking within the system? Are we exploring ideas? Are we exploring any piece of equipment? And are there even any drones for naval fighter aviation?
So the good news is that the thinking is there, and not only is there thinking, there's a lot of planning. There's a lot of genuine study work that has already been done and is being executed in some pretty interesting ways by the Indian military and specifically the Navy also, as far as how drones can get into the mission, as it were. We're talking everything from small drones to high performance big drones. Now, when we're talking about naval drones, remember that the deal for 31 drones that is currently being finalized with the United States, that includes most of those drones. 15 of those drones are going to be Sea Guardians for the Indian Navy. Now, those don't operate off an aircraft carrier deck, but they operate off an airfield. And those are very, very capable armed naval drones. So the Indian Navy has already used a couple of leased versions of those drones for a few years now from Arakonam in Tamil Nadu. So the Navy knows what drones bring to the fight. The Navy doesn't. Let me just say, the Navy doesn't need convincing that drones is where it's at. This era of battle, this era of combat is going to be. Drones are going to play a very, very indispensable role in that. They're not a luxury. It's not like ki agar hai to acha hai. It's not that. You have to have drones. The Indian Navy has already acquired drones, and I'm very happy to say, from Indian startups and Indian companies for cargo handling on ships. Wow. They've acquired these small drones for their ship, and I'm not talking about those silly Chinese drones. These are proper purpose-built drones with high-definition cameras for surveillance from ships, basically like little helicopters from ships to conduct surveillance operations. There are drones for mechanical work on board ships as well that are being used. Now, when it comes to actual combat, the need for a deck-based fighter drone has not yet been felt necessary, even by the countries that operate drones in a big way, because drones can fly from anywhere. The requirement to actually launch a combat drone from a ship deck has not been felt necessary at this stage yet, because because drones are armed drones of the kind that we're talking about. They operate already very, very far from their home bases. They are capable of operating for 36, 48 hours. So unless there is some kind of new requirement or new mission in a battlefield where an aircraft carrier needs to be able to launch an armed drone, that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. Two reasons for it. One, the technology already exists. Like, for example, if the United States wants to suddenly turn out a deck-based combat drone, they can do it because they're already doing it with their refueling drone. There's a drone program called the MQ-25 Stingray, MQ-25 if I'm not mistaken, Stingray, which is a deck-based air-to-air refueling drone. It's basically a drone that can be launched off a deck. Boeing won that contest. It's a drone which is the size of an aircraft, by the way, takes off from an aircraft carrier deck, flies up there, and fighters that are in the air plug into the drone and get their gas, get their fuel. And then that drone comes back and lands. Miraculous technology. So nothing theoretical stops the United States from saying, I'm going to take that drone platform, sling on some weapons, and voila, it's a combat platform. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but I'm just saying that the building blocks for such a capability are definitely there. But in terms of using combat drones, let's put aside the requirement of them having to be strictly functioning from an aircraft carrier deck. They don't necessarily need to. The concept of loyal wingman drones, which basically fly controlled by fighter aircraft or helicopters, is there in foreign aviation. The United States does it already. HAL, India's HAL is building something called the CATS Hunter, which is supposed to be a fighter controlled combat drone. That's a concept right now, but it is being developed. But it also proves that the companies building military aircraft in India are thinking on those lines, which in my view is the best possible news. And this is a point that I mentioned in one of our previous episodes, is this entire drone revolution for the Indian military is being almost wholly led by small startups. It's fabulous. There are companies that have been started by former military personnel together with people from IIT and other institutes who've come together with small budgets. They've raised some funding and developed little core technologies, swarm drones, other kinds of autonomous technologies that are very, very attuned towards small specific requirements that the Air Force or the Army or the Navy might actually have, which is why these logistics drones that you see deployed in Ladakh are all made in India, developed in India. The software is made here, right here. None of it comes from abroad. Similarly, I think it's just a matter of evolution now, Dev, for these smaller drones to become larger, more capable drones. And when you have companies like the Tatas and Mahindras and L&T and all getting into this, or rather being permitted to get into this in a big sort of combat way, we have all the building blocks to do that kind of thing ourselves.
Yeah. Right. Great. I think I will end it there. Thanks, Shiv. Fun chat. And, we focused on a topic that, isn't really talked about much when it comes to matters of defense in India or military equipment, which is Navy's fighter jet. Which is why I wanted to, just like ask one small question at the end of this episode. How happy do you think the Navy is going to be that, the two of us have focused on something that must be a worry for them? Not a worry per se. Like, we've kind of talked about how it's like it's kind of okay situation. It's not as bad as the Air Force right now, where they keep screaming, oh, depleting squadrons and hamare paas ye kam, itna kam hai. But the Navy also has its fair share of problems, its fair share of issues they would want highlighted, addressed, they would want the government of the day to focus on. But like you said, again, because of this very small number of just like 40 odd fighter jets that it requires versus 200 and 300 and 400, not much attention is given to this topic. So do you think they'll be happy that the two of us brought this up on this podcast?
I think they'll be very happy, and I can tell you that one of the consistent pieces of feedback we get for our podcast, and I'm very thankful for this, is that we are fair, that we are not reluctant to talk about the shit that exists in all of these complicated issues, and what I like most about the feedback that we get, and I'm sure I'll get this from the Navy, is that we speak with with a sense of national interest.
Yeah.
We ask questions, and we go where most people find it uncomfortable, because at the end of the day, even in this particular podcast, I think the ethic with which both of us speak is that we hope the Indian Navy gets what it wants, because we acknowledge with each of our episodes that the men and women of our military do a bloody difficult job. The both of us are sitting here and talking about it, and I'm giving so much gyan, but it's the people out there, the men and women who are out there having to fly these machines, risk their lives. They've got families at home wondering about their safety while they're out on a deck. They're doing incredible, dangerous, unparalleled things, which most of us can only dream about. So when we ask questions about safety, about efficacy, about combat strength, about economy, about whether we're getting the best bang for our buck, I like to think that you and me, Dev, are speaking for the men and women who are flying those planes out there. And I think that's all we really need.
Yeah, and we'll keep continuing to do that on this podcast. So thanks, Shiv, fun chat, and thanks to our viewers and listeners as always. And once again, I think I should record this and play it again, because I really am glad with the comments we get on our YouTube channel and through our messages and email. So keep them coming. A lot of you also have ideas that you want us to talk about on these episodes that we have. So please send in your comments, please send in your requests, and we'll keep making notes. And whenever we get the time, we will definitely talk about what you want us to talk about. So that's it. Thanks to our producer, Anna Priyadashani, as always. That's it for this week's Defense Toast. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries with your passport. Bye-bye.